Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I have some great stories today as we're moving towards the 4th of July about the founders of this great country as they were led by the hand of the Lord to provide an environment of freedom. This land was dedicated from the beginning of time to be a free land, and the price was paid by many people. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verse 80, it says, "And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men, whom I have raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed this land by the shedding of blood." The men who fought for our independence and sacrificed did so at great expense. Brigham Young said, "The men in the Revolution were inspired by the Almighty. For this cause were Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, and a host of others inspired to deeds of resistance to the acts of the King of Great Britain, to bring to pass the purposes of God. It was the voice of the Lord inspiring all those worthy men who bore influence in those trying times." I'm going to take several of the things I talk about today out of this great book by Timothy Ballards, The American Covenant. He's got a series of these, and they're excellent books. I recommend them highly. 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. By the end of the war, 9 of them had been killed. 5 of them had been captured and imprisoned by the British. 12 of them saw their homes burned, looted, and destroyed during the war. Many of them sacrificed everything they had. We all know about George Washington. He's the father of our nation. But what you might not know is that in the French-Indian War, George Washington was a major in the colonial forces. Almost without exception, every engagement that he was involved with or led ended in complete failure. In fact, he had to surrender at Fort Necessity. At the beginning of the French-Indian War in 1754, Major Washington led his troops towards a group of Indians. And at the head of that group of warriors was a great chief. He was the father of many nations, from the Great Lakes to the Blue Ridge Mountains. And he said, as the redcoats marched towards them, it was like blind wolves walking into a trap. And their faces turned white with terror when they heard the war whoops of the Indians. The Indians were armed with muskets from the French, and his men were excellent shots. He boasted that they could shoot a squirrel as it jumped from one tree to another right out of the air. And he recognized something in George Washington and told his men, "He is not of the Redcoat tribe. He is of the Long Knife tribe and will fight like we fight. We must kill him." And he directed his men to focus their fire on him. And these were excellent marksmen, and they couldn't hit him. He said they shot off his hat. Bullets went through his clothing. They shot several horses out from under him. But he said the Great Spirit protects this man. He cannot be killed. He will become the father of many nations. And he did. Another man you've probably never heard of is Thomas Nelson. He came from a prominent family. He'd received an advanced degree from Cambridge. When he came back to the United States, he was married and elected to the governing body in Virginia at the time that was recognized by Britain. But he began to be involved with the feelings of revolution, and he led men and began to form the beginning of the Virginia militia. We've all heard of the Boston Tea Party, but most people have never heard of the Yorktown Tea Party. And he led his forces as they captured several British ships in the port and dumped their tea into the harbor. He personally dumped several crates of tea into Yorktown's harbor. And this was the impetus of the British no longer recognizing any colonial governing body. He was subsequently elected to the First Continental Congress. On May 14th, in 1776, he proposed the following resolution: "Our delegates in Congress, being joined in the strongest and most positive manner to exert their ability in the procuring of immediate and clear, full declaration of independence." His motion was seconded by Patrick Henry and carried. It was adopted by the First Continental Congress. He was subsequently elected to the Second Continental Congress and was one of the first signers of the Declaration of Independence. He pledged his personal wealth. He had a substantial fortune, and he began to finance the Virginia militia. He led them in several battles. His health prevented him from staying with his forces at all times. But towards the end of the war, as the British had focused in the southern colonies, the forces of Lafayette joined the Virginia militia, and they chased General Cornwallis over the Blue Ridge Mountains through Virginia on a sustained march, and Cornwallis finally sequestered himself in Yorktown, Virginia. And he selected the most beautiful home in town as his personal headquarters. As Lafayette's men and the Virginia militia set up their artillery, they began to pound the town. Colonel Nelson directed artillery fire at his own home to root out the British. They were joined by all the colonial forces. The harbor had been blockaded by the French, and soon more French ships arrived, completely surrounding Cornwallis, and he surrendered in disgrace. Thomas Nelson had spent his entire fortune. It's estimated that he gave more than $2 million to the Continental forces, particularly the Virginia militia. By the end of the war, his fortune was ruined. He was living in poverty and without any recognition, and died in 1789. Another man that was known as the financier of the American Revolution was Robert Morris. He was perhaps the wealthiest man in America at the beginning of the Revolution. He had a fleet of ships and would take tobacco from his farms and other American goods to Europe and Great Britain and sell them, and then he'd bring back supplies. As the revolution began to gain traction, he began to smuggle military supplies for the Continental forces on his return trips from Europe. He originally opposed the Declaration of Independence. Britain had offered generous terms to the colonists. They had told them that they would give them complete amnesty. They would cut their taxes from 5% down to 3%, and no one that had participated in the revolution would be punished or lose any property. And since he had a very successful business, Robert Morris was in favor of that. But the motion of independence carried through Congress, and as it came up for a final vote, Robert Morris agreed to leave the floor of Congress with his contingency so that the bill would pass. And then he later signed the Declaration of Independence, and he pledged his life, his honor, and his wealth to the movement. And he followed through with that. He began to finance the military efforts. Any ships that were found from America on the ocean by the British were confiscated. Robert Morris soon started to hire pirates. They called them privateers. Even his own ships had battles with the British ships, and if they were victorious, they plundered the ships and took their supplies. But if they lost, he lost his crews and his ships. He continued to carry out large-scale importing of weapons, ammunition, and supplies for the Continental Army. He became the de facto commander of the Continental Navy. They were his ships. It was his fleet, so he just inherited the job. But the finances of the United States were in complete shambles. By 1778, there was rioting. The slavers, the merchants, the farmers, the revolutionaries were all fighting against one another. Inflation was rampant. Our government was set up so that the states controlled the collection of revenue through sales tax and through property tax. And the federal government did not have control, according to the framework of the Constitution, to tax the people. And as a result, the federal government could not raise any money to pay the troops. And so Robert Morris paid the troops. But his fortunes began to decline, and he finally organized the first bank in North America, the Bank of Pennsylvania. But it was largely backed by his personal finance, and this bank paid the troops. The federal government had printed paper money, but that just added to the problem of inflation. And by the time the war ended, the United States economy was disastrous. The government set up several cabinets. They had the Minister of War, the Minister of Marine, the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Robert Morris was unanimously placed as the Minister of Finance, and he organized the first bank of North America. And it again was largely backed with his personal wealth. After Cornwallis's surrender, Morris tried to get the government to set up a 5% tariff so the federal government could begin to pay off the debt from the war. However, the states controlled the purse strings, and the state of Rhode Island blocked this effort, and so the soldiers that had fought in the Revolutionary War for 5 years remain unpaid. Finally, Robert Morris gave $800,000 in 1781 of his own money to partially pay the troops that had won the victory of our freedom. He continued to try to get the government to come up with some way of paying the national debt. And finally, in 1783, he resigned as the Minister of Finance. But the men around him convinced him not to do it, and so he served for almost one more year. But in 1784, when he finally resigned for good, the federal government was $42 million in debt, and most of the men that had participated in the Revolutionary War remained unpaid. Before the War of Independence, Robert Morris was perhaps the richest man in America. In 1799, Robert Morris was placed in debtor's prison for 2 years. His wealth was gone. He had given everything he had to the War of Independence. The Bankruptcy Act was passed in 1801, and he was released from debtor's prison. He died in obscurity and poverty in 1806. These great men gave everything they had for our freedoms. One young man didn't have fortune. He didn't even have a wife. He had just finished a degree from Yale University, where he'd graduated with honors, and he joined the Connecticut militia. He soon became a lieutenant. He was intensely eager to enter into combat against the British, so he joined Knowlton's Rangers. Knowlton Rangers was the first intelligence organization in the United States and was the foundation movement of the CIA today. And they were responsible for raids and reconnaissance to aid the Continental armies. As the Battle of Long Island began, George Washington was being soundly defeated, and he had retreated to Harlem, and he needed information about British troop positions and movements, and he appealed to Knowlton's Rangers. They had a disdain to be caught in disguise behind enemy lines. They felt it was disgraceful and knew that you would be executed for such a thing. The only man that volunteered was Nathan Hale. He was 21 years old. He was outfitted as a schoolmaster looking for work. He had his diploma from Yale University, and he snuck behind British lines, and began to gather information about troop movements of the British. One evening he was in a pub when Major Robert Rogers recognized him as a revolutionary. He approached him and pretended to also be a patriot. Nathan revealed himself to Rogers. He was subsequently arrested and held in jail as they prepared to execute him. He asked for a Bible and they denied his request. As his execution drew near, he asked for a minister, and that request was denied. He was finally given some paper and a pen and allowed to write a letter to his mother and his brother, and those letters were ripped up in front of him. Marshal William Cunningham was a witness of this and of his execution, and he said, "He behaved with great composure and resolution, saying he thought it was the duty of every good officer to obey the orders given by his commander-in-chief. He said, 'I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country.' He didn't have a fortune to give, but he gave what he could for our freedom, the freedom that we celebrate." Again, the Lord said in section 101, "And for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men, whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood." If you find yourself engaged in conversations where you're denigrating the men who fought for our independence because they had personal flaws and practices that you don't agree with, I would submit that you are entertaining angels, unaware that they are angels of darkness. These men fought and gave what they could so that we could be free to do whatever we want to do, but especially so the gospel of Jesus Christ could be restored to the earth with the keys of this dispensation to welcome in the second coming of Jesus Christ. The Lord loves you. The Lord loves all of his children. That's why he has set this land apart from the beginning of time to be a land of freedom. I hope we can all support that freedom and do our part to sustain it. You may find yourself in a position where you don't feel you can do anything, where you feel like you're not good enough. But you need to know that the Lord loves you and that you're important to him as his child. If you doubt this, I would ask you to kneel down and ask the Lord, "Do you love me?" And if you will do that, you will feel his love pour into your heart and into your mind. And you will know that you are on the earth at this important time, and that you too can play a part in preparing this earth to welcome our Savior Jesus Christ for his second coming. I hope you've enjoyed these stories today. If you have, please like and subscribe here. If you liked this story, you might like this story. You can see all of Brother Merrill's stories here. Thank you.